Podcasting since 2005. This is the King of Podcasts radio network, kingofpodcasts.com.
20 years ago today, Apple put podcasting on the map.
The King of Podcasts radio network proudly presents the Broadcasters Podcast. Here is the King of Podcasts.
Welcome to the Broadcasters Podcast, celebrating alongside Apple 20 years of podcasting. Yes, we're going to go into what the history of what this was and what it means. And the fact of the matter is that I have been around, not as a King of Podcasts under that name, but I have been doing podcasting for almost as long as Apple has been in the game of podcasting. So for my story real quickly, it was July 2005. I was working over at Clear Channel Radio in Palm Beach, their cluster, West Palm Beach. Great wallpaper on the walls. You have 5 radio stations in there. Wild 95.5. You have the Gator 98.7. 1230 WBZT. 1290 WJNO. Cool 105.5. And the Gator 98.7 FM. So there were 6. But 1230 we didn't really count too much. It was just kind of there. Either which way, I'd already been there 2 years, full-time working for them, working overnights. And I knew that in the world of radio, which I love, and if you know this program and you've been listening long enough, since day one, the reason I did this show is because it is my passion for radio and audio and for media in general. I love what audio is. The audio space we have right now, which was radio. And at the time in 2005, radio was already in the throes of so much consolidation because of 9 years prior of all these different radio stations being bought up. Bud Paxton, Larry Mays, among others, that decided to go ahead and just start buying up the market. When they knew they could buy 8 radio stations in any given market, they did. And of course, no, FCC is going to now open up ownership limits. They're already looking to go ahead and get that started up. So they're not taking public comment. That's current news today. But back then, Clear Channel was at its biggest. iHeart had not even become a name yet. That doesn't come for a while. But the thing was with Clear Channel, they were at their peak. Some, 800 some odd radio stations around the country? They owned so much. And they took on debt from all that came in from all these different companies that they were able to call acquiring stations from, because of these other companies that were acquiring stations, AM/FM radio networks, Chancellor Media, J-Core Communications, and then they just start picking them off. Different companies, we're going to buy this cluster, we're going to buy this cluster, merger, and they did, and it was up to an amazing feat. Because of those 6 stations, I try to think about the fact that Aardman Broadcasting ran Wild 95.5 before it came to Clear Channel. American Radio Systems was a company that had WIRK, the Gator 98.7 and 1230 WBZT. 1290, I forget who was or WJNO, I forget who was the owner of that. It was Mallrite Communications, wasn't it? I think it was. And then I think of Cool 105.5. Well, that was a change because it had changed different formats before. I don't even know if 105.5 before it switched from 94.3 The Beach, if it changed from there, or Oldies 94.3. That was a different company altogether as well. So it was like 4 different companies prior to Clear Channel that all these stations were owned by. And they were very well programmed. Then by 2005, they're all at a point where you still had people on air in the studios. They didn't take phone calls live. Not really. They were basically 9 to 5ers. So somebody would be there for morning show, middays, afternoon drive. But then after that, these same people would also be doing voiceovers for other stations in the cluster, or for other stations in general. And you only had a couple of people at night. So when I was at Wild, we had Ed Elder, shout out to you if you listen, and Valentine, who did nighttime for Wild. And then there was not really anybody else. And then Vinny Perazzi, I remember working in the Gator overnights. And I was sitting there in 2005 at one point doing 7 days a week, overnight in there. And I was just like, okay, I'm running Coast to Coast AM. I'm checking all the stations to make sure they stay on the air. And I'm just like a night watchman. And I just sat there and I'm like, this is what radio's become. It gets not good. There's no liveliness to it, no creativity, because there wasn't. Like, there's only one big event in West Palm Beach that the Clear Channel cluster actually really ever supported, and that was Sunfest, which is like a 4-day festival, but they got a lot of promotion out of it. And that was pretty much it. But they didn't really get themselves anything else. And the other talent, while there was a lot of great talent that worked at all these stations, they were limited, and they had their hands tied on what they were really going to do. But there were so many people that I got to work with in there that had so much talent, and they weren't allowed to use their talent at all. If they would have had a chance to have podcasting at that time, I'm sure some of them would have gone into that and tried to do something with it. But in 2005, we needed something to give us some creativity, some outlet, some vessel to be able to go and do something more. And podcasting, in its very infancy, did get started. I mean, with the company that I'm with now, still today. You know, I'll go through the names real quick. So, webmasterradio.fm and cannabisradio.com. Now, Webmaster Radio is now called WMR.fm because we have gone to a more general format. So they've been owned and operated by Darren Babin and Brandy Shapiro Babin. So husband and wife. I've been working for them almost 20 years coming up, August 1st. And I learned about this. There was one day I was looking at the monster job listings in the Clear Channel building overnight, and I sent my resume over. Interviewed July of 2005, July 14th, offered the job. I said, I can get out of here in 2 weeks. So let's make it August 1st. I started. Immediately got thrown into the fire, and I was just amazed by the fact that they were live streaming, because at that time we didn't start doing recordings that we would go and post up later. It was kind of doing that, but what was happening was, before I got there, you know, the hosts, which was either Darren or Brandy or others that they had working together to do programming, they would just go ahead and record the show. They wouldn't edit it. They would just go ahead and post it somewhere so that people can go and grab it and download it or listen to it. I mean, yeah, you just had to be able to download it. That's pretty much it. But it was not an amazing science about it. It wasn't until I got there and Mark Winter, who I was working with at the time, he was working on one station, I was working on the other, because they had two podcast networks they were operating. And then we started editing the shows. We decided to go into the business of audio archiving, but would actually go ahead and edit the shows down, clean them up, so they were presented so you could hear the start and end, and it was just a full-fledged show, and we posted it. Like, all we did was go through an FTP server and just push it from local up into the server, and that was it. And we were doing that for a couple of years. And then Apple came around. And for whatever reason, then the RSS feed could be allowed to be put into Apple Podcast or into iTunes, because iTunes already gotten themselves a pretty good rap with their music format, and then took on podcasting. If it were not for Apple Podcasts, if it not for Apple adding podcasting to iTunes, I don't know where we would be today. But it was an amazing thing to have happened. And I'm really happy that they decided to go and do that. It's really been wonderful. So even before podcasting came into play, before Apple entered the scene, I remember getting myself entrenched into streaming audio, because going back to 1998, because at that time I started seeing that radio stations were starting to stream real audio back in the day. And that was a very archaic version, but it was very interesting. And of course, Mark Cuban owned it. And then we got into the part where I was listening to WCW Live. And for whatever reason, professional wrestling, they got into the audio game very early on. And they were doing live streams after their programming and after pay-per-views, and I would catch those. I was like, wow, this is amazing. You can call in and again talk to these people. It was really cool. And so I got really into that, where I got a couple stations that I could find. Oh, they're streaming their stuff. And it's like I can listen to a station from somewhere else around the world, and I don't even have to go ahead and listen to on my FM or AM radio. That was fascinating to me. So I did that. And then we had RSS feeds to start syndicating blog content. Of course, blogging was a big deal. But again, 2001 to 2003, we had adopters starting to experiment with adding MP3 files to blog posts with the enclosure tag. But there was no way to automate downloading or listening. And then podcasting was actually coined, according to when I asked ChatGPT, they were suggesting names for the growing trend of downloadable audio blogging, which could include audio blogging, guerrilla media, and crucially, podcasting. Now, it's a combination of iPod and broadcasting. Then you know about Adam Curry and Dave Weiner. They are credited with the technical and promotional breakthroughs that define early podcasting. Adam Curry, former MTV VJ, he allowed users through an application called iPodder to download audio files from RSS feeds and sync them to their iPods, the first podcast aggregator. And then he launched his own show called Daily Source Code, September 2004. Go forward into 2005, here we are. Libsyn, by the way, which was my first podcast host, was one of the first podcast hosting platforms. So Apple would add podcast support to iTunes 4.9, June 2005. So once I got there, we hadn't gotten into Apple Podcasts yet. That was still new to us because the process to get your shows listed there took a while. I think it probably took us until late 2005 to start getting shows up there. And we had shows that did very well at that time, talking about SEO, affiliate marketing. We were also talking about programming for adult webmasters because, the porn industry was still moving along. It was getting cracked down because of various United States statutes for reporting and for, logging in information about the content that was being done and the performers and their ages. So that was a change in that. But slowly but surely, people started talking about podcasts. Steve Jobs would talk about it at the Apple Worldwide Developer Conference in 2005. Then mainstream media, NPR and BBC, got into podcasting, started releasing their own podcasts. Apple didn't invent podcasting, make that clear, but the integration gave it the mainstream infrastructure and distribution power to evolve into the global industry it is today. Because Apple, that was the outlet. It gave us a place to go because we already knew that iTunes, everybody was going to it. And to have access in that platform was very important. It changed everything for us. It was a game changer. August 1st, 2005, I am doing, 7 or 8 podcasts regularly a week on the one side of programming we were doing. And then the other side, we had another 7 or 8. And then we grew Webmaster Radio to 20 some odd radio shows regularly. And then that was what happened was that in Halloween night 2006, one of our other networks, we put it to rest. And then Webmaster Radio was our own focus all the way up until 2015. June 1st, 2015, as a matter of fact. Just celebrated Cannabis Radio's 10th anniversary. And then what we did there was, for that time, we put in through a lot. And it's amazing some of the companies and groups that came through the doors working with us, whether it was to promote one of the conferences we would go and support within the search engine marketing industry, whether it was Dow Jones or Apple or New York Times, having companies that would come to the mix that would become important today, like GoDaddy, ShipStation, AccuQuote. It was amazing. And we had some really amazing companies going across, working with us, Infusionsoft. And I just think, we were just amazed by who we got to go and work with. And then really the interaction of the programming changed so much in this time because when we first started, we also had our own chat rooms. IRC, remember the chat room days? And it would be amazing how we would get a podcast up that was going on live, and we would have over 100 people in the chat room talking away. Now you have Discord that kind of does the same thing. It's the replacement of IRC. IRC was so crude and antiquated, but still we used it for many years after, into the 2010s. But then it changed after that, and it was the one thing that was always the issue that people had a thing about when it came to how to have interaction or feedback to a podcast. That was one thing that was interesting, because everything we ever had in television or radio always allowed us to have room for instant feedback. We have it now. If you're putting a video podcast out, whether it's on X or YouTube or, wherever, Twitch, there's places that are not even podcasts, but they kind of are, but they have the same kind of mix of it. And then the other part was the technology. At the first beginning, when we were doing podcasting, we were using phones. So we had Telos phone hybrids, just like a radio station. Like, we had an actual engineer that worked on radio stations, did a damn good job. Hell, in the early days, what was it, 2009, 2010, I want to say, ESPN Deportes was moving facilities out of where they were doing broadcasting from Coral Gables. They had broadcast facilities there. They were kind of consolidating. I think they were moving back to Bristol, Connecticut. And when they were moving, our engineer at the time, Bob Hobler, shout out to him, he tipped us off on some furniture they had over there, and it was owned by the Walt Disney Company. It actually had it on there. And so I had, for a good while, we had real professional control room equipment to broadcast our podcast on. And then we moved it over to a building. We were always broadcasting, for the most part, out of Fort Lauderdale or in Broward County for the most part. And it was only until COVID that everybody kind of moved in their own locations. But then by then, we didn't have to be in a central location to do podcasting. Now people could do it anywhere. But we went from phones. 2006, we got the Skype. And then we just stayed with Skype and kept using that to give us a clear sound of our content. And I remember we always kept certain nuances of radio into the mix. We would keep shows at a 30-minute format. We would have commercial breaks. We would have things where we would make sure to go and tip off to the audience. We'd have great promos. We'd have great commercials. We would produce to make sure that the content that people are listening to all the way through was entertaining, informative, and insightful. And people could listen all the way through and they wouldn't be bored. And we really took a lot of time to make sure our programming really stood out. And of course, we had some shows that went 60 minutes, but still, if we're going to do those shows, we wanted to make something that was really good and people were going to like. And then Zoom came in, I want to say 2015, 2016, I think it was, and changed the game as well. And then we started having the video content that was available because, Skype wasn't that great into it. And of course, Skype's gone, amazing enough, earlier this year. But I'll tell you, man, the changes that have happened in this space going through that time, I mean, it doesn't feel like it was 20 years ago. That's for sure. What's also been amazing is the amount of mainstream attention that's gotten, because podcasting has taken a lot of what radio used to be. And I will say at the end of the day that people that were in radio trying to adopt podcasting or to transfer, when they were in radio for so long, it was hard for them to go ahead and to adapt. And of course, there were some people that did learn how to adapt and were able to go and find a way to monetize. But that was also an issue. It was very tough to do that. Like, even for us, when we started doing podcasting, the beginning model for our networks was advertising. We did traditional advertising up until about 2009, 2010. And then we started doing things where we would offer half-hour specials to companies to go ahead and promote their products. To the point then, when we started going, we decided to go the brokered media model. And we said, no, we're going to allow people to do their own podcasts. We're just going to give them their own series, and we're going to produce it. And it did take us a while to kind of work that process. And we'd have shows come on, and we were really good at retaining programming and having certain companies that would stay with us for years, 10 years up to much, to stay with us and continue to do this content. And it was amazing because it was such a wonderful way. We wouldn't do brokered media. We would make sure it was a good radio show where the company was in its best light, but we would also make sure to know how to use their expertise. We knew how to go and present their people the right way. And it didn't matter what we did. But also the best part was that we could also broadcast so easily because we can go ahead and be very portable. Like we learned portability and it just got easier and easier as we went along. And we learned. At this point, we're at another phase of podcasting because AI has come into play. AI is making the process of presenting, preparing, promoting, podcasting has gotten much easier now. Like the process now for me to do a podcast is so much quicker than it ever was before. Plus, we have to incorporate social media into it, which came shortly after. I mean, when we really realize how much everything changed, and then Apple comes in again, changes the technology to iPhones, and then the access of podcasts wherever you go, no longer beholden to your iPod or your laptop. You're telling me you can go ahead and listen on your phone, your tablet, and wherever you want, possibly your watch. And now people can go anywhere to listen to a podcast easily. And there is a plethora of podcasts out there. And there are plenty of those that I want to shout out the fact that they've been around for years. I mean, for me, I would have got my podcast series up sooner if I could. But the only thing I was dealing with that I had an issue was to be able to afford the hosting and to also get a website up, be able to afford that and get one set up because it wasn't easy before. Like when I set up my first website, I had to have somebody help me out with it. And I just happened to be in an incubator in this co-working space / incubator in 2012, 2013. And I got to go and meet some great coders and some great developers. And they said, hey, we'll set you up with a website. You can go and put your content up. Really? That's awesome. And so I'd already set myself up on Libsyn and I started putting my content up there and started hosting it. And then through the help of Ryan Teixeira, I want to shout him out because he was the one that helped set up my first website. And through FTP, I was putting up my programming for the Wrestling Goes Through podcast. The first series I had, December 18, 2012. Now it's gone to about like another 938 episodes, I think, so far to date. And doesn't stop. But there's been so much change to that as well. But almost all the shows that I've done of my own podcasting have been for the same bedroom I'm in right now. I got a lazy boy chair. I got a table right now where I can position however I want with a microphone attached to it. I've had the same Shure SM7 USB for the last 4 years to work off of that. And now the technology I have to create podcasting compared to what I had to do before, night and day. Incredible. And I think for me, there were obviously people that were in radio that could not adopt well, but it was also fascinating what the early podcasters did to the space and how they also changed things up. Because we had podcast shows that programs that just were casual. It wasn't stuck to a clock. And you know, in some cases, the way they just did it was just so nonchalant. And it was real conversation. And that's the part of podcasting that has stayed today. We can still have casual, uninhibited conversations because they're almost rude. The fact that we can listen in and we can preen in on whatever content there is that we're listening to. And everybody's in here doing a real relaxed kind of space, unless you're doing something that's like a video podcast. You got to set yourself up and you got a spaced out studio. You got the cameras all over the place and you're doing a whole setup. But still, there's still something about the intimacy of podcasting now that I could just do this here on my chair and I could just talk into this microphone. And for whatever amount of time I've already been doing this right now, I can just talk through and I know I have an audience out there that's going to listen in. And Apple caused this. They made it possible. So into what actually happened with podcasting itself. They have a milestone right now. They've launched a dedicated webpage titled 20 Years, 20 Podcasts We Love. And They wanted to highlight some influential shows that have shaped the industry over the past 2 decades. But now we look into where everything went. The initial directory of iTunes had 3,000 podcasts, a central hub legitimizing podcasting, making a recognized form of entertainment. Steve Jobs, at the time they launched this, iTunes 4.9, he says, quote, "Podcasting is the next generation of radio, and users can now subscribe to over 3,000 free podcasts and have each new episode automatically delivered over the internet to the computer and iPod." Bam. Game-changing. Watershed moment. And Apple has always been leading the charge in the ecosystem of podcasting. And so everything just really changed up. And obviously they saw the benefit of podcasts, and they always incorporated it and made it more important. The significant change for Apple and what they did for podcasting was creating their own standalone Apple Podcast app. It would be pre-installed in every iPhone, the first iPhone that came out in 2014. So podcasts would be a core part of the mobile experience. And of course, when that happened, that's when we got the real breakthrough of shows. I have said this before. It was 2013. And I remember, and if I'm correct, I think that was when Anna Nicole Smith died. The day she died. And I was listening on AM radio, through streaming, by the way. I was streaming WMEN Man Talk 640, and they were running the Donna Mike show live. And I called in the Donna Mike. And I made a comment about Anna Nicole Smith. And for whatever reason, they asked me, they wanted to go ahead and troll me. They asked me, what do I do? And I was like, oh, I'm in podcasting. And I told them what I did. And Don Geronimo says, oh, that's means you're nothing more than like that's no different than you working at the McDonald's, kid. That's basically what he said. And I just think about the fact that, okay, took a shot at me. And Man Talk 640 actually put a promo out there where they used that clip of me calling in because I said I was from West Palm Beach. And they said, well, they decided to go and use my clip as promotion for the show. So it played for a while. But then what happened was like this, okay? Radio allowed the medium that they had the control of audio, talk programming, music programming. They allowed, through corporate greed, corporate mergers, through private equity companies owning all these companies, all these stations, all these airways, all these towers, they allowed podcasting to take their spot in the medium. And again, the digital disruption, it affected every medium there is out there. Television, cable, newspaper, all of it. And radio would be affected by podcasting. And it didn't have to be that way, but they allowed it to happen. Because podcasting gave a democratization of content creation. We now had a free and open platform. So we didn't need radio to get our voice heard, to do an audio program and have people find it if they wanted to catch it. So independent creators like myself, building our own communities, and then finding ways to do advertising and sponsorships to make money, to make a living. I'm not going to get into some of the shows that Apple decides to go ahead and talk about in the space, but 2 decades later, Apple is still investing in podcasting. They recently introduced new features like a wider range of playback speeds and an enhanced dialogue feature to improve the listener experience, reaffirming commitment to the medium. And by the way, it's not just them. Like, one of the spaces that I'm really, really happy about that has been very important to me is Adobe in the last couple of years. Because they've also contributed into the podcast realm by creating new technology for enhanced dialogue. So it's their podcast enhancer. I've been using it for 3 years now, where I can basically take whatever recording I have, whether it was through somebody else on a phone or somebody else on a bad microphone, it doesn't sound really good, it sounds kind of tinny. I can run it to that podcast enhancer. And when I turn that back and download it off their website, I instantly get a great sounding show. It sounds crystal clear. And they continue to improve on that technology. It's gotten even better. Now they also have their studio, the Adobe Express program. I use that. And from there, I'm having fun. I'm able to create great audiograms now that you see for the YouTube channel. All my YouTube content, I use Adobe to create video versions of the podcast, not a camera version where I'm on camera. I don't do that. But at least you can actually read along the captions. You can follow along, and you have it on the background, just like everybody else watches YouTube, right? We listen to YouTube. We might watch if there's anything there to watch, but that's the other part too, is that in the last 10 years or so, even more than that, YouTube has become a major place for podcasting. And Google never got themselves where they could do enough to really make podcasting something. They always did try to get into the market of it, but then they decided they're not going to go and put it under the Google banner. Let's put it under YouTube. Because YouTube, they found out, was really the place to go and get podcasting and really make it something special. And then we had streaming across the board. And I really got into streaming in 2016, where I just got fed up with radio in terms of music. And I decided, well, I'm going to just go and find something else to listen to on. And the Spotify was like the spot for me to go at that time. I mean, I know it had already been around for a couple of years before, but then I finally got on there. And then Spotify started adding podcasts. And, it's been going on ever since. We had Stitcher back in the day, which has now been bought up by Pandora. And now it's part of SiriusXM. And SiriusXM got into the game of podcasting. And iHeartRadio got into the game of podcasting about 10 years ago. Everybody got into it. There's the audio companies. That's the worst part. Radio, to be able to go and compete, they couldn't compete with their own medium. They had to get into the medium of podcasting. And then they did get into podcasting and did a horrible job of it. The only radio company that actually did things right in the podcasting realm was NPR, because they got into it early. This American Life was out for years beforehand. And from that program there came Serial, which was the first significant audio series in podcasting that really drew listeners. That's what broke the mainstream. That's what crossed over into the culture. Mainstream culture crossed over when Serial became a series. And I give This American Life and NPR and Chicago affiliate over there of NPR, I give them a lot of credit for what they did to the space and made it very important. But then iHeartRadio comes in. Well, okay, all these morning shows, we're just going to go ahead and rehash our morning shows, put the commercials in and all that, the traffic checks and the weather checks and all that stuff. We're just going to throw the podcast up there and see if it's going to work. And then they started asking their radio hosts, after they'd done their podcast, or their radio show, after they'd already done 3-4 hours of programming, you got to do a podcast afterwards. So one of the producers I have right now working with us, that's been with me almost 10 years now, coming up, one of the things he was doing before he left radio, because he was working a radio cluster as well, a big radio company as well, Alpha Media, his thing was he was working with a host that was on the #1 morning show in West Palm Beach. Still is. And for a while, they had him, I don't think he was making any extra money for it, but they wanted to use him in a podcast. They said, let's do a sports show. And the host, he might know some sports, but he wasn't like the sports kind of host. He would never be the kind to do a sports radio show. And so the producer that's working with us now, he had to go and help support that show with prep, with co-hosting along with his other host. And they had to make a 3-person show to make it something they could prop up, because they needed this particular morning show host to prop up the show. So they did it. I think it was done for 2 years. And he was working at that station. And then eventually he started working full-time for us, because it was basically a part-time that he was working at over there. And more or less that's where he is at now with us. And we've been in this space ever since. But he was working in radio. He was doing a lot of stuff in radio over there. Music radio he was hosting. Working on a morning show in the cluster there for the talk radio station over there. One of the bigger talk radio stations in the market. And then eventually was producing content with us. And to see that, 10 years later, what the radio space was giving, where you could still have people that were listening to radio, and, radio was still kind of there. But truthfully, COVID and the lockdown was another moment that changed everything, because when people were home and they couldn't do anything else, people decided to go and pick up podcasting. And there were a lot of podcasts that got launched as a result of that. I mean, when I was stuck at home, I was just doing more content. Because at the time, what else was I going to do? I'm going to sit at home for a year. So I did a lot more content. And it was really big to go and continue on. And I learned so much from doing podcasting. And then in the process of doing podcasting with what I do in my full time, the process to help out the clients, host their radio shows, give them the prep they need, to the point where if I needed to go ahead and just let them just sit down and just give them a script to read, I could do that. Like, we've had to learn so much about how to go ahead and satisfy and how to be a concierge to all these podcast series that we host and we support and represent. To the point where now, I mean, I would go ahead and coach on the fly to various programs, but now I just do emails, or I just do things where I could take the transcript to a program, read through it. I can also go through and find the clips quickly, send them over to a host, and give proper feedback. And it's gotten to be done so much quicker than I ever thought. And so now, to write up descriptions and just find everything else to help support the hosts of these programs, and not to mention the kind of organization I can use as well to be able to go ahead and coordinate all this with the producers, with the hosts, with myself. It's amazing. And we've learned a lot in doing this here, because we're not doing radio anymore. It still is radio at the end of the day, but podcasting is a standalone format, and it has its own style, its own rhythm. We're not beholden to a clock. In some cases, we're not even beholden to commercials. If we are, it's because, like, for a program like this, I have ads being embedded in by podcast hosts, because it's helped me to go ahead and monetize and put some value to this. And same thing with YouTube. Eventually, when I get the amount of watch hours that I need for the programming on there to build up, so I can finally monetize that channel, another revenue stream. I'm working on it. But we've taken so much out of 20 years of this and what it's done. And no one's been able to go ahead and make a better name of podcasting. It just stuck. And so for that, what has podcasting become? It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, a fundamental part of the modern media landscape. We used to have Apple's iTunes. Now we have Apple Podcasts. The iTunes still exists today, but it's now Apple Music. But it's played a critical role in making this all happen. And there was some information they found about podcast listeners. So I want to take into this real quickly about how far this has gone. So into the stats there are currently in podcasts. This is for 2024. Over 500 million podcast listeners. 1 in 4 internet users listen to podcasts. There's an estimated 4.3 million podcasts. In the country of Sweden, almost half of the citizenry actually listen to podcasts. In the U.S., there are well over 100 million podcast listeners. Almost 1 out of every 3. The average American tunes into 8 podcasts per week. Spotify and Apple Music have over 60 million U.S. podcast-based listeners. U.S.-based listeners, over 60 million combined. And here's the most important demographic. The most important number you could really say is that podcasting is for the younger audience. Half of U.S. adults, which would be of U.S. 12 to 34-year-olds, listen to podcasts. 12 to 34 years old. And I know that because of my programming, especially some of it that I have, I get a younger audience. That's amazing. Meanwhile, radio caters to an older audience. They're trying to hold on to what used to be 25 to 54-year-olds. Now it's more like 35 to 64 or even older than that. That's what they've been resorted to. There are 504, more than that now, over 505 world 505 million worldwide podcast listeners, equating to 23.5% of all internet users. And the listenership has just continued to increase year over year, with major increases when you look at 2019. There would be a 22% increase. 2020, 20.9% increase. 2021, 15.5%. Over double digits every year up until 2023. But then you look at the marketing in terms of the percentage of internet users. It broke 20% of internet users in 2022. And it should break 25% by the end of this year. In the U.S., 38% of Americans have listened to a podcast within the last month. 26% have listened in the last week. And year over year, podcast listeners have increased, reaching an estimated 140 million people. In 2013, we had 32 million people listening to podcasts. And to grow that to over 164 million by 2023. Incredible. That's exponential growth right there. As of 2016, 55% of U.S. consumers were aware of podcasts. They knew what it was. Now, podcast platform usage. It used to be Apple Podcasts was the number one leader in podcasting. Spotify now leads that charge. 1 in 4 podcast listeners use Spotify for podcast listening. I'm one of them. 1 in 5 use Apple Podcasts. As of 2020, Spotify would have 25% share of U.S. listeners, 20% for Apple Podcasts. Then it was Google Podcasts after that, Pandora, a show's website, Audible, NPR One, TuneIn, Deezer, Podcast Addict, Radio Public, Stitcher, Overcast, Pocket Casts, and CastBox. And then there are podcast publishers. iHeartRadio now has been at the very top with over 31 million unique U.S. monthly listeners. As of July 2023, they had over 870 active shows. Wondery, which is second place, had at that time 232 shows, NPR with 49, New York Times with 12, and so on and so forth. And there are so many major companies now that are doing it. The next thing that comes into play is where people listen to their podcasts, because the big change that happened was when we started getting the infotainment dashboards in all vehicles. And Bluetooth was no longer the necessity to plug in to be able to listen to content on your phone. Because once we had the change to Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, another game changer. Because then people can listen to in their car to podcasting, which is where you really listen to a lot of audio. I mean, when you think about it, if you're driving, that is the place where you listen to a lot of audio. And people don't necessarily go into FM or AM radio anymore as they used to, because they can go and find what they have their content on their dashboard, whichever apps they want. Approximately 32% of 18-plus-year-olds listen to a podcast in a car each month. AM/FM radio continues to change year over year, down on average year over year 8%. Own digital music, which is actual physical copies of music, whether it's CD, cassette, if you still had an 8-track, 5% up. Oh, digital, excuse me. That's digital, so like if it's on your iPod or if it's on your phone. CD music. CDs down 6%. Podcasts would be up 4%. And Sirius XM, that was embedded in a lot of cars, down 2%. The most common device for podcast listening now is a smartphone, 73%. Higher than a desktop or laptop, which is 13%. Podcasts now today make up 5% of all audio listening among U.S. Americans. Today, almost 2/3 of Americans 12 years older and up have ever listened to a podcast, accounting for at least 177 million people. These numbers are amazing. This is today. Look at how much that means. People know what podcasting is. That is not a term that 10 years ago, you could understand why people didn't know what a podcast was, but it's changed now. Now, one thing I will say is that we have a lot of podcasts that are up there that are by some really big people, right? There are a lot of celebrities that are up there now with their own series. And there's a lot of podcasts that are of a high end, like they're almost like books or almost like their own dramatic series, scripted dramas, things like that. And there's a lot of high-end, high-polished programming that's out there. Don't get me wrong, but I mean, some people would go ahead and just choose their entertainment with audio in the first place through podcasting. But what's most important is that there's a lot of grassroots programming like mine. And I think that's very important to go ahead and make a distinction that we have that out there for people. And it's wonderful. And it's amazing all the shows that I've gotten to listen to and who's out there putting their voice out there and how they do it. Like if you wanted to go and find a podcast every day, you could be discovering new podcasts every hour on the hour for years. And you would never run out. That's incredible. That is incredible. Now, the 20 shows that they have here in this 20 years, 20 podcasts we love list, among the ones that I would note is This American Life, Serial, Las Culturistas, The Daily, Call Her Daddy, Dolly Parton's America, Huberman Lab, Sweet Bobby, Baby This Is Kiki Palmer, and Therapist, among the others that they have in here. Marketplace, which is a program that's hosted by American Public Media. You would listen on the NPR station, you would hear it. One of their hosts, Megan McCarty, spoke with Nicholas Qua, podcast critic for Vulture New York Magazine, and in their conversation, she asked about what the business of podcasting was like at the beginning. And he says, it wasn't really a business model. Early podcasts were just making stuff and posting stuff around. The analogy of the blog that rose with the rise of Google AdSense, the spam ads you see on the internet, that was the early form of monetizing blogs and websites. And there wasn't anything like that for podcasts at the time. The big hurdle that everybody had with podcasting, which is very true, is the advertisers couldn't find out the size of the audience. And their advertising could really turn around any ROI for them. That was the biggest problem they already had. They also asked about the fact about YouTube becoming the primary place now that people access podcasts. So podcasting went through kind of a bubbly period, they said. That was during COVID. A lot of money coming in, a lot of venture capital, a lot of speculative money, and a lot of shows that cost way more than they were able to make the money back. And the pandemic, the bubble inflated further because a lot of media companies and film and TV companies couldn't produce their work. So celebrities turned to podcasting that drew for their attention, and there were major economic changes over the course of the pandemic, causing the bubble to burst, right? So there were a lot of podcast shows that got canceled, a lot of companies laid off staff. Yeah, the big companies, the corporatization of podcasting was really big at that point because their normal routes of entertainment or programming were gone, and people would not be willing to leave their house to go work on anything because they were afraid. And justifiably so. But now we have YouTube becoming the standard. And Megan McCarty asks about why are podcasters leaning into YouTube now, even though it's been around a long time? And Qua says that from a lot of podcast companies going, they were asking where's the next frontier growth? Where do we put our podcasts on the internet? Because a lot of it is just chat. Talking in front of a mic with a video camera going in front of them, like slap it up on YouTube, reach a wider audience. It's already baked in with the algorithm that YouTube has. And it's really only been in the last 5-10 years that video forms of podcasting really took off. It's always been there in some kind of iteration, but the video podcast form we have right now today really came in about 10 years ago and really came in during COVID. So Quaz also asked about the innovation coming up in the future of podcasting, and he says that he thinks there's going to be a conceptual innovation, reframing, or being more granular and specific about what exactly we're talking about with this medium, It means we don't just use the word podcast anymore. It's all about pulling back together into this giant blob of content, and podcasting is not part of that blob. It is. I mean, podcasting, I think, would be the nucleus of where a lot of content can come from. Basically, you kind of put your flag here, and you have content that comes from here, and then you can go ahead and spread out content from wherever. But you can do a full media blitz. You have written content, the visual, the audio, the transcript, and then you have all the social media that will clip it down and make it very compartmentalized so that either people want to just catch the highlights, which they might do with my programming. If you find my content on YouTube or LinkedIn or TikTok or X, no Facebook or Instagram, they banned me. By the way, I got to say this too. In social media, I understand in podcasting, this is very important. This is one contention I have with podcasting right now, and it's not the podcast hosts, it's not the podcasters themselves. But there is something to be said about, with radio, we have censorship. We don't have censorship necessarily, but we have FCC regulation. And there are certain things we can't be talking about on the air. But there is something to be said about, in podcasting, that some of the platforms we host our content on, not so much the audio content, but the video content. If you're posting clips on social media, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, X, if you're trying to go and get anything up there in terms of visuals or audio content up, and there's terms and conditions, of course, rules of service, terms of service for all these different sites, but they're still very vague. But when you're telling me there are certain things that will get flagged, number one, because somebody out there is willing to go ahead and report on something they don't like, or something they find offensive, or they find maybe hateful or hurtful, whatever it could be. Like, I like to think that in my years of programming and doing broadcasting, I have a good idea of what things I will not talk about. First of all, I don't talk about religion. I don't talk about abortion. I don't talk about those various taboo topics that are just out there. But even just this week, I had some content go up on social media, up on TikTok, and I posted it, and it got taken down. And I got a warning for it. I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I understand with YouTube, you get strikes for copyrights for if they're taking particular music or using something out there, or if there's adult content. Like, YouTube will get me for those kind of things, and I can understand that part. Maybe if I forgot, I might have it set for adults over 18 to listen to the content, but there might be some other switch I didn't change to make sure that it's explicit programming. Then it should not be listened to by children. That's fine. Like, all my content's set for explicit, just to be safe. But then what I also do is that if there are certain people or certain topics that matter, or certain politics especially, polarizing, that there are things that you are not allowed to go and bring up on these platforms because we don't know what the rules are. I don't care about if it's right or wrong. I would rather have what the FCC gives me. I have a set of rules, a set of regulations that have been put in stone, and we all follow it. Because the fear of losing the license, we don't want that. And if people want to go and report the FCC and say, hey, we have a problem here, then we can get called out on it. And justifiably so there too. But when I have to be able to watch out for whatever content I'm talking about, all my content's apolitical. The one thing was, I took commentary from a podcast up on YouTube, which is legally and rightfully not banned. It's up there. Nobody's complaining about it. I mean, people might be complaining about it, might have comments about it, and they're entitled to it. But all I did was take clips from this podcast. That's it. And I cited it on my program that I was going to use the clips. All I did was take the clips, take the commentary that was said, and then I gave my take on it. I wasn't agreeing with the commentator. I said their views were extreme. And then I adjusted what was being said because I thought there were some nuggets of truth to what was being said. And I circumvented it. But that wasn't enough because someone reported it and said, oh no, because this particular person that said it is hateful. Okay. But there's something to be said about, I can't even say anything about that. That doesn't feel right to me. I don't want that kind of censorship in podcasting. Does that make sense? That's the part I have an issue with. And here's the thing. I don't have to worry about censorship if I know what the rules are. So I would love if there was some kind of podcasting rules and conditions. Like, give me what I can't talk about. I can't just follow along with what cancel culture will say or what other people will going to say that might be offensive. Because if I had to worry about every little thing that people could be triggered by or offended by, man, then we would talk about nothing. But we have to be able to go ahead and take the chance and talk about things and not be fearful of what could happen if we take the content down. Okay? That's where I come from with it. And so that's one of those things in podcasting that have been a little bit worry to me. I just don't understand why that's happening. So in the future of podcasting, I want that to change. Because for the good of podcasting, I want people to have their ability to have the freedom of the open platform that this is. Now, of course, people will say, well, if this particular platform won't let you hear, then someone else will. Okay, but I don't want it to be where I have to be in this gray area and I don't know if something I might put up will be taken down. I know for next time, I'm not going to put that kind of content on TikTok. Fine. I wish they would give me a clarification. That's all I want. Facebook and Instagram, they did the same thing where it had to be somebody that reported it. Some content that they didn't like, but it's like, I'm not the one saying it. But I can't even comment on it. I can't debunk it or dispute it. Like, why can't we do that? That's the other thing I didn't understand. And that's where podcasting needs to grow. Because to think that podcasting could be more censored than what radio is wrong. Okay. I've already gone about an hour on this content here. I didn't realize I was going to go in so long-winded on it, but there was so much to say. But there's a few more things to bring up before we're going to wrap things up. So let's go into that now. A couple of different stories I want to bring up before we wrap things up, because I had a few other things I had before I realized Apple was going to go ahead and put the announcement of 20 years of podcasting. But first of all, there's a report that came out from Muck Rack about the state of journalism 2025. And I probably might take some more time to talk about this next week because there's quite a bit to go and say about this. But real quickly, they did a survey during April 2025 with more than 1,500 journalists in the U.S., UK, Canada, and India to understand the current state and future outlook of journalism. When asked about the most concerning issues, more than 130 respondents say disinformation and misinformation are the most serious threats to journalism's future. Other issues of concern include public trust and lack of funding, 28%, politicization and polarization of journalism, 25%, and government interference in the press at 23%. There's a lot more to go and bring up about this, but I will go into more of this. By the way, in terms of the importance of AI, nearly 8 in 10 journalists now surveyed have said they use AI tools at work in the last year. More than 40% are using ChatGPT, 40% are reporting they're using transcription tools, 35% using writing tools. There's a lot more to that, but we're going to go and bring that up next week. I want to follow up on that a little bit more because we actually have the report and I can go into that in more detail. So we'll get into that. Another story was about coming out of the wrap.com that the creator economy now, it's $500 billion today. And creators are becoming more entrepreneurial. And there were a lot that went to the Cannes Lions event in France this past week. And that's what really got people's attention. Madison Avenue Brands were strutting ground there. And they had people all talking about AI and other things that we're going to be talking about. But what caught people really were the creators. And so you had different creators that were holding court in various events. The creators industry is now a $185 billion industry. It's rising to become $500 billion. Wow. So we had the upfronts that we were talking about last week, and television was setting things up for advertisers. you had all the major networks and major corporations doing what they're going to do for the streaming services and for their linear platforms. But then there was a lot of energy and excitement that came from YouTube, because they have the creator industry that's really positioned there, more robust support infrastructure, bigger, more far-reaching agencies, new monetized creator programs, and AI tools bringing down production costs. So creators are becoming more like entrepreneurs rather than just social media personalities, and advertisers are starting to notice. So there's a story that came out that creators are estimated to generate $184.9 billion in revenue globally in 2025, up 20% from 2024. And then there's a report that says that the economy by 2027 will reach $480 billion. That is monster. And with YouTube's presentation of the upfronts, they talk about that the headlines that came out of Cannes Lions point to the decline of linear and traditional models and what new means of distribution can pick up the slack. In the story from The Wrap as well, they said that a shift in consumption of patterns for entertainment, news, and information has hamstrung many long-established means of disseminating content, pushing newer forms to the forefront. That's true. I mean, listen, even for me, I don't really catch myself turning on a television at all. I have a television right now in my bedroom I have not touched in 2 years. It's just sitting there collecting dust. Got a cable box. I got Amazon Fire Stick on it. I can go and watch it for one on it, but I don't. I'd rather watch stuff on my 15-inch laptop screen. Just because. A Reuters poll recently found social media surpassed TV and websites as a preferred source for news. We talked about that before. And that Nielsen reported that streaming accounted for 45% of TV usage. This is all amazing stuff, but that's where we are right now. Now, the other story I want to bring up that was also talking about when it comes to journalism. In Australia, they had the University of Canberra releasing their own annual survey of trust in the media. And Australians' concern was also about misinformation. That Australia urgently needed a national media and digital literacy campaign to help news consumers feel confident about their ability to spot misinformation. They were asking, what will that campaign look like? And they broke down the fact that journalists are taught that news stories should contain the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why. I've heard that. I've heard it, and I've done it, and I've applied it, and I've said it many times. The last W in the model is more complicated to say why, because that's how you apply meaning to an event. Why has something happened? Why is it important? So interpretation of events can be hotly contested and lead to accusations of bias and everything else. So it's the issue of the why that everybody's having an issue to, a lot of contention about. So there's a lot more to go and get into that as well. But like I said, interesting stuff. We'll see how things go for next week and talk about it, about trust in the media, because I think that's a pretty good subject we can bring up and follow along on this and go a little more in detail. But podcasting has its day today. So on behalf of yours truly, King of Podcasts, and all those that are in the podcasting space, I want to go ahead and celebrate with you that Apple has given us 20 years of podcasting using their platform. And I am proud to say that this program, along with all my other programs, initially start at kingofpodcasts.com. And of course, you can find all my other content on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, iHeartRadio, and so many other places. So I'm thankful for 20 years of podcasting. I will be celebrating my 20th year August 1st, and we'll talk about that here on the program. But I hope you get into podcasting if you've never done it before. But most importantly, podcasting is great content. And remember that content is king, and the control of your content is in your hands.